So, welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about the placement of Pluto in the 7th house. Now, as is usual, I'll start with a summary of what Pluto is. Now, I have done this several times, and I don't know if it's the right thing to keep repeating what the definition or delineation of the plutonic effect is, but somehow I think it's necessary, because without placing the plutonic effect within the right context, or without defining what it's supposed to be, then it may make the conversation itself a bit flat. So here we go. What is the plutonic functional light? Now, the functional lights, like I've said earlier, they are aspects of self-consciousness. They are the ways in which you perceive yourself, and you can think of them as attractors, so that your behavior is really made up from all sorts of possible responses. These functional lights, they serve as attractors that are largely the same for everybody, every human, that is. And that means that they are identities of some kind, but they're pseudo-identities. They're not the identity you call yourself as a oneness. They're pseudo-identities that exist within that oneness because they are a part of the oneness. They're just the ways that this oneness behaves because of the structure of human psychology, the structure of your human personality. It actually is a geometric structure. It has a shape. So you can think of the functional lights as aspects of that shape or invariants of that shape. All right? Geometric invariance in some sense. And what this means is that they tend to be the default way that people respond to things. So the plutonic functional light is the way that certain aspects of your being respond. It's not essentially down to your will. It's just the way that human psychology is built. And Pluto represents the very deep part of that psychology, because when you're looking at human psychology and you're thinking of how the structure, the shape is, well, it's the solar system. That's what you're looking at. If you pull out a more accurate representation of what the solar system is as it exists within a gravitational well, all right? As the sun goes around the galaxy and as it drags the solar system with it, the sun rotates, so it's also rotating that solar system. Well, that structure you're looking at, that's the structure of human psychology. That's why astrology works. If that's not the structure, then you don't know what you're talking about, basically. Okay, and in my classes I teach of how this psychology itself, the geometry of it, is the geometry of the entire solar system, the shape of the gravitational potential. Now, if you look at that gravitational potential drawn in most books, you'd see it as just some type of curve, smooth curve. Well, it's not. Overall, it smoothens out, but right down in the details, there are many, many eddies. It's like looking at a river from a very high point, or a high topography, or a high topology. Well, if you're at height and you're looking down at the surface of the ocean, everything appears very calm. You might even come to the conclusion that the surface of the ocean is a very smooth thing that doesn't really change. But as you get closer to the surface of that ocean, you begin to see details. And by the time you arrive at the surface, the details are overwhelming. They're just too much. That's the way it is in the solar system. Space-time, it looks smooth when you're looking at the solar system from a distance. But as you zoom in, it contains a lot of movement, a lot of eddies. The solar system itself is the structure that exists within that chaos. The stable structure. Well, that stableness, that stability, it's in your head. It is you. It is the thing that patterns your sense of self-awareness. And that's why you have functional lights in astrology. Okay, they're all down to gravitational physics. So you can think of the solar system as some type of space displaying some type of orbital dynamics, right? Of the planets going around the sun and all that. Well, you see that what you call an orbit really is a grading of some kind. So when you go from the outer solar system, like you have in Pluto, and you go all the way to the sun, you see that planets are able to have these elliptical orbits. And within that space in which they have their elliptical orbits, there's nothing else there. They're in control of that space. You know, the Earth goes around the sun. There's nothing bumping into it as it goes around the sun. So what you're looking at is a gradation that starts from somewhere at the furthest reaches of the sun's influence, and it starts to fall into the sun, the gravitational well. The depth of it is sitting where the sun is. All right. So that is the structure of how self-awareness is built. Because what you're looking at as a solar system, it's replicated in your brain. That gradation is in your brain. And that's what the functional lights are. They are gradations of awareness. I mean, when you get to the center of it all, the sun, self-awareness, the focal point of attention, lights up. But prior to that, there are other senses of self that don't light up. They're just there in a sense of sitting like attractors. They control their own sphere of influence. And so sometimes you can even call them spheres. And you have a lot of narratives that reflect around the beauty of the spheres or the music of the spheres or whatever you want to talk about. It's all talking about this. It's the fact that your sense of self-awareness is really a replica of the universe. And the closest part of the universe to you is your solar system. That's really what it is. That's where the functional lights come from. Because those functional lights are representations of structures and organizations in your brain. It's all gravity. It's all gravitational physics. Remember, what makes you unique as a human being is that you get to experience the reality that you are making sense of. You are mapping into a reality that is unknown. As you are discovering it, you are experiencing that discovery as a sense of self. Don't forget that. That said, Pluto represents that aspect of ourself that is so far away from our consciousness that it belongs to the laws of nature, really. It's the way that nature builds things and recycles them. Its primary function is to make sure that the right things are behaving in the right way. When there is a mismatch of any kind, then it's ruthless in the behavior because it's triggered almost instantaneously, the downgrading or the destruction of that thing so that it can break down and so that something that is more akin to the environment, because that's exactly what it is. It's a match between a part of the personality and the environment the person is in. So that the individual's job is to basically construct like a mirror image of that environment. Now, sometimes this is difficult because people are raised in environments that are very traumatic, very painful, with lots of emotional intensities, most of it revolving around the shame that comes from sex. Okay. And most of that shame is crystallized very early in the individual's development when they are not ready for it, because maturity means that we come of age, especially where sexual matters are concerned. You can imagine that for a teenager, your hormones begin to inject this sexual inclination into your bloodstream. As you become a teenager, you begin to become more aware sexually. All right. And as a result of that, your behavior changes. Now, what happens to children when they encounter intimate sexual experiences before they understand what it means? Now, there's an aspect of the biochemistry and the biology of the child that connects to that sexual experience because you're a human being. You're literally like a device, a biochemical device, of course, a very sophisticated and a very complex biochemical device. So there's a response, but the child does not know what the response is. Because remember, when you are born into this world, you have no knowledge of what you are. Yet what you are is present. Otherwise, you wouldn't be. Okay? And what you are exists on a level of knowledge and understanding that is beyond your comprehension because it represents the highest expressions of organized complexity. Okay? And I have a lot of podcasts where I talk about where organized complexity is. Now, so the human being is carrying the most advanced knowledge as themselves, but they don't know what that is. So the job of the human being is to come to understand what that thing is, and then to understand it as a sense of self, because a human being is the only creature on this planet that experiences its awareness of its surrounding as a sense of self. None of the animals are able to do that. The human being is experiencing a reality, some type of environment, all right? They're experiencing it through their material senses, and they're making meaning of it and using that meaning to construct and maintain a sense of self. And so when you are experiencing yourself, you are really experiencing your environment. And what is it that you're experiencing in that environment? Is the dynamism, the movements, the cyclical behaviors, the way things come into existence, the way they are taken out of existence. That's a very plutonic thing. Because you're talking about the cycles of nature, the creative, destructive cycles of nature. And their job is to maintain fitness, to maintain functionality in terms of usefulness. Because if anything is not useful in nature, once it loses its functional good, then it is quickly eliminated and recycled. That's how it works. And the calculus for this is essentially ruthless, because it doesn't take into consideration any of the higher things, really. Is it useful? Yes. Stay. Evolve. Is it not useful any longer? Well, break down, recycle, eliminate. That's the scorpionic aspect of being. So you can think of it as a very primitive aspect that is also very important, because It is the aspect of our psyche that helps us to hold on to material existence. And that's why we feel it as a sexual nature. And it's deeper than just play. It's not playful sex. It's very intimate sex, because it's not about sex. It's about that connection to existence itself, because that existence itself, that's the way that it operates. The ones who feel it most are more sexual beings, but it's not sex for the sake of fun. It's sex for intimacy, because what it really is that they want to know what that root is. That's the desire that sits within them. Now, sometimes these desires are experienced too early. And once they're experienced too early in the human psyche, human beings can't process it. And so the only way to deal with it is to push it into the back of the mind, which is like the unconscious, and then to suppress it. Now, this happens on a personal level, but it also happens on a collective level. For instance, a secret that is shared amongst people, it's plutonic, because nobody wants to talk about it. Why? Because it's scary. Because it upsets the narrative that we're running. Okay? The problem is that narrative that is being suppressed, it represents the root narrative. That's what plutonic expressions always are. The plutonic functional light is always a type of root narrative. It is so basic in its behavior that to suppress it is basically to ignore an important aspect of reality. And usually the reason why it exists is because without it, you would kill yourself. You would decouple from reality in some sense, because there'd be nothing connecting you to it. It is your desire that allows you to hold on to existence, but it also forces you to try to explain what existence is, because you are experiencing existence as a sense of self. That desire to explain what existence is, because you're experiencing that desire as a sense of self, that's what we call knowledge. So to acquire knowledge is to acquire the true experience of yourself, to be able to understand how that experience emanates. Now, I've said that it's a very sexual thing, but it's hard to really put a finger on the name of that thing. So I would only explain it as the only physical explanation of that thing is the orgasm. Now, you would say, but the orgasm? Yes, it is. Imagine if you could be in an orgasmic state. Whatever that means for you, however you enjoy it, whatever pleasure you derive from it. Imagine you can be in that state forever. And now imagine that state is not just stable in some sense. It's growing. So the orgasmic experience is growing from moment to moment. And that's the only way that reality can be experienced and understood. What type of human being would you meet in that state? Would it be a human being that is constantly oohing and eyeing? It's constantly some type of pleasure? No. You get to a state where there's no need for the oohing and eyeing again. You're just in a state of continuous bliss. Why? Because it's not sex that you're experiencing. It is the revelation of knowledge, meaning that you are constantly understanding exactly what existence is all about. Constantly, and it just keeps growing. And what that means is that you are becoming more and more aware, deeply, deeply aware from moment to moment, and not just you're aware of everything in that sense. So that since existence is infinite, that awareness just grows to infinity, keeps growing. And as the awareness grows, all sense of shame, all sense of fear, all sense of everything changes, everything disappears. Because if you look at your fears, they're really based on what? Lack of understanding. When you don't understand something, you're afraid of it. It's just the way that it works, right? But the more that awareness grows, especially when you now become aware of space-time in such a way that there is no past and there is no present anymore. There is just a unity. And because you are aware of it, that's what you are. That's what you become. You think you're still going to look the way that you look? Of course, you'll be transformed. Because the way that everything looks is based on the stories we're telling ourselves about what we can perceive of existence. As those root narratives change, existence, the way that you are perceiving it, the way that we are seeing it, the way that we're experiencing it, that also changes. Okay? And what that does is that things that we could not perceive before, they now come into view. It may seem as if they're just somehow miraculously just there. No, but they've always been there. We simply could not perceive them. We simply did not realize the nature of their existence. Okay? These are all aspects of the plutonic psyche, because what the plutonic psyche wants you to do is to understand that root reality, the very basis of it, not to be afraid of it. Because when we don't understand it, a lot of things emanate from it, and almost all of them are destructive. Very, very, very destructive. Why? Because we run away from them. We're afraid of them. We're ashamed of them and all those things. And the only way that the human being can handle these things is to project it. Okay? So the fear must have something or someone that you're afraid of. That's how it works. And it must be in the unconscious, meaning it's a taboo. So nobody talks about it. It's such a dreaded feeling. The feeling of, oh, we've done something so wrong and so horrible. Well, the distance from that feeling to a sense of deep shame is not very far. It's not very long. Okay? So it is very important to understand what the plutonic aspect is, to understand how it sits within as human consciousness, to understand what you're experiencing, and then to embrace it. That way, its manifestations are not destructive because you are aware of what is going on. When you feel a very strong sexual attraction to someone, you understand what you are feeling. That there is an aspect of the way that you experience the universe, right? That is connected to what that person is. Your job is to understand what that is. It's an aspect of your personality. There's a way that you are telling the story that allows you to hold on to existence as a self-aware being. There's a story you're telling yourself. You know how living things hold on to existence? They have sex, at least complex living things. They have sex. That sexual act is not really about the sexual act per se. Because after all, what is it? Okay? What is it? What does it mean for two creatures to come together and start mating? What are they really doing? You think the animals know what they're doing? They don't. Okay? What is that thing that is going on? It's a connection of some kind. Some part of one of those organisms will be injected into the other organism. So that a part of another person, a complete stranger, I need you to understand what this is. A part of a complete stranger now sits within another person in such a way that it translates into another human being. Do you know that your body, your physical body, is designed to reject anything that doesn't belong to it? Completely. You try to graft somebody's blood into your own, it'll probably kill you if you don't match the blood types. And even that, there's always the chance of rejection. Why? Because your body knows what it is. Everybody's body knows what it is. Alright? And yet, you run into a complete stranger you've never seen or met or whatever. You guys have sex. And a part of that person's body is ejected into another person's body. And it begins to trigger conformational changes that lead to the development of an entire human being. Why is there no rejection? In some cases there is, which would account for one of the reasons why some people become barren, or some people, they cannot have babies together. Okay? It's more like an immune thing. Maybe one person's body sees the other person's body as, sort of like an antagonistic way. Okay? These things happen. But what I'm saying is, in general, our bodies are not designed to work like that. Okay? That's why there are no human races, because your body does not sense the type of change that restricts those conformational changes once the two sex cells have fused together. They won't even fuse together if they're human races. Okay? So every single racist that you know of, they are absolutely ignorant and foolish because it doesn't have a definition. Sometimes I get very confused as why the dissonance doesn't really just hit people in the head. You're talking something that you cannot prove. And it has been tested as many times as human beings have had babies in this world. And it always comes up false. And yet you still hold on to it. Alright? It's a rejection of some aspect of sexuality. It's a plutonic thing. That's why the podcast, Pluto's final entry into Aquarius, that's why it's a correction of sexual stories. Because it's a very dysfunctional way to think. Okay? That's really what it is. Well, the essence of the plutonic functional light is to correct those types of things. Because, like I said, otherwise they're very destructive. They destroy everything, including the individuals, everything. Pluto in the 7th house has this problem. Why? Because once they begin to project a reality, any type of narrative that makes a crossroad outside of what they consider to be their internal experience, they meet that Pluto immediately. Always. And the first inclination is to run and go and hide. Because you don't know what to do with it. You don't know how to deal with it. Because the first impression always comes from the fact that you think that that Pluto is outside of yourself. It's not. But it will take you time to realize that. Because the realization itself is a transformation. Because it is calling you to become aware of that aspect of your nature that allows you to couple to reality. Like I said, it's a very sexual experience. And the idea of plugging one person's sexual organ into the other is a way of connecting back to what? To nature. The underlying forces of the universe. Alright? That's really what it is. You tap into it. It's the female that carries that in that sense. You tap into it and you connect to all of existence. And through that process, you can summon life. Especially in the human case, you can summon a new life. And it comes into the universe and becomes a thing. All right? It's a very powerful thing. It's just that it's underappreciated now because of the way the narratives are being told. Because of racism, anti-black racism, there's a lot that evil has done to the human psyche. It has damaged everything, really. It really is the most evil thing that can sit within a human being. Why? Because it's a denial of something extremely fundamental. That's why it's extremely plutonic. That's what's going to make the next 20 years very interesting. All right? As Pluto traverses Aquarius. Because Aquarius is what? Aquarius is a human being. It's a symbolism for what a human being is supposed to represent. It's not just a human, it's everything about a human being, both what the human knows and what it doesn't know. And Pluto will be moving through all of that, calling out and pulling out this idiotic ignorance and bringing it into the light so that it can be addressed. So everywhere you look on this planet, there is the game of anti-black racism playing out. Everywhere you look. Well, it has to be drawn from everywhere. So you are looking at events that will change the world as a whole, not just as a group of people, the entire world, because that's humanity, isn't it? Right? So when a person with Pluto in the 7th house steps out into the world, any aspect of the world outside of themselves, they run into the plutonic functional light. And usually there's always an early event that crystallizes what that Pluto is supposed to mean, right in the person's consciousness when they are young. And because they don't understand it, it's meant to be frozen like that within them. And so it represents a very hidden source of fear, trepidation. I'm talking about the fear of death itself. And so the individual basically has no real need to try to project outside themselves. As in, they find it difficult to really get into anything because they are afraid. Now, gradually, as the individual grows up, they learn to conceal this fear. And they learn to compensate. And one of the ways in which this compensation can happen is an individual that displays a tremendous amount of emotional intensity. And what does that mean? It's almost like connecting the passionate flame within you to something that is very existential. The individual is always very, very emotionally intense when they meet others, especially when matters begin to tend towards sex. Why? Because within them sits a direct line from their self-consciousness right into that sexual depth. They are aware of it. They are aware of it every time they see another human being. And you know what creates anti-black racism? It's the sexual organ, the male sexual organ. It's the penis. All right? And why does it create a problem? It's because there are different weather conditions on the planet. Different climatic conditions in that sense that are local to each environment. Now, but there's only one climate on Earth. But within this one climate, you find many types of persistent weather events. And sometimes the weather events, the patterns, they look like they're very different to other places on the Earth. Because on the Earth, in some places, you have deserts. In some other places, you have what? You have frozen wastelands. There's nothing there. All right? So you have things that look like vastly different temperatures. But they're not really. And these temperatures, they are measures of dynamism. Dynamism is what life is. Life is a capture of the dynamism within an environment. And that dynamism, carbon with other elements now begin to mimic them. And once the plutonic effect gets a hold of that, then those mimicries become cyclical. They become cycles. And life is the maintenance and the sustenance of these cycles. That's what you get from the 5 principles of organized complexity. You understand? The computations, the biochemical computation needed to generate this sustenance, that's what we see as life. From unicellular life to multicellular life. And some people will tell you that it's just a chance event. That's not what you get in this channel. In this channel, we have proven conclusively that the whole of existence, the whole of physical existence is just looking at a human being from a different perspective. All the laws of nature, everything you can imagine, everything you can experience. You're really just looking at a human being. But you don't know that you're looking at a human being because there is no representation yet. When everything comes together like that, it comes together in a human being, as a human being, and then you recognize it, but you don't know what you're looking at. Okay? Now, within that human being is the complexity of everything. That's why, mainstream human beings right now, they don't understand life. They don't understand how life was generated, why it was generated, and even worse, they don't understand self-consciousness. Now, these are the same people that are building artificial intelligence. They don't know how their own intelligence works and where it comes from, but they're building machines to mimic it. What do you think they're going to build? They're going to build the ignorance of themselves that they have. Now, a person with Pluto in the 7th house also can face the opposite. That fear can press them down so much that they run away from the whole thing. And what happens is they get to meet that fear externalized. Because Pluto, it's an aspect of ourselves, a very important aspect that we repress and suppress. Normally, everybody represses and suppresses it to some extent so that we can live in some type of Saturnian organized society, right? So it represents repression, suppression, oppression. But these create depth, because if you want to hide something, you have to dig deep and bury it there. So Pluto, really, its main role is to allow us to deepen the psyche. Because if you're going to understand something like a human being, where you come from, what you really are, it's saying that you have to understand the entire universe. And not just understand it the way that people understand it today, where you learn a lot of mathematics, you learn a lot of physics, but you go home and you still don't know anything. Because you don't know who you are, you don't know what you are, you don't know what love to your partner means. You don't have the context for that. For that, you're asked to go to the social sciences or to religion. But you go to your work every day as an astrophysicist or as a cosmologist or as a theoretical physicist, and you can write down equations that describe the very early part of the universe. So how is that possible? How can you know that and then not know what it is to you? It simply means that you don't really know that thing. Those equations and all, you don't really know what they're saying. Because the context within which you would properly understand what they mean is missing. So now all you see are just equations, but you don't know what it means for you. You don't know what goodness means. You don't know how it affects anything. So the only way you think of being able to use that thing is to externalize it as some type of technology. But what is technology? Look at all the mainstream technologies today. What do you think you're looking at? You're looking at externalizations or representations of power. Why? Because power is intimately connected to sex, right? Because the different environments on Earth created different adaptations in different type of human beings. It's the same human being, but each one now is mapped to an environment. Because as an organism, you have to map to your environment if you're going to survive. As there are different variations in the environments on Earth, you have different human beings that match those variations. You understand? No. What is really typical or unique about these types of variations in that there is another calculus playing in, because one of the key identities of Earth, this Earth, is that it's a living world. So on Earth, life is able to start and life is sustainable. And there's been life on this planet for billions of years. So it's not a fluke in some sense. There is a physics around the Earth that allows this to be and to be maintained. All right. Now, that life itself, it tracks something, because you have different types of environment, but life is a dynamism. Movement. Movements require energy. Okay. Well, that's the reason why you have a sun in the sky. Because if that sun wasn't there, everything will assume the background temperature of space. And that can be very, very, very low. Life is not possible. So the sun is there to provide the energy, the thermal radiation that allows life to organize itself. It's part of the reasons why you can have a living world. Now, in some dynamic places of the Earth's climate and environment, you have greater energy, greater solar energy being transacted. In some other places, because of the dynamism of that same environment, well, the solar energy dips. And the patterns, because of the way the Earth is shaped in terms of its geometry, its movement and everything, some of these patterns are sustainable. So within Earth, you have not sustainable, but pseudo-sustainable. So within Earth, sometimes you have places that can be deserts for thousands of years. And then things change and they become savannas or tropical forests. The two places that don't really change are the poles. The Earth's poles. They remain frozen in some sense. Why? Because they are representative of the type of thermal dynamism that is taking place there, and life reacts accordingly. You need energy for life. In the places with the least amount of energy, there's less life or less dynamism. Human beings have had to adapt to all these things. So human beings that had to adapt to environments with very low dynamism, their bodies had to change to match those environments. And since energy, heat, allows things to move faster, the process of moving faster is the process of growth. That's how your biology interprets it. Okay? So in very low energy environments, growth is restricted. because there's not enough currency, energy currency to spend. In places where you have much more thermal dynamism in the environment, growth is asymptotic in that sense. It just grows and keeps going till it plateaus at where the energy, the sustaining level is. It plateaus there. Now, what you tend to see of those types of environments is that a proliferation of biodiversity. That's what you tend to see in those types of environments. Many different types of plant forms, many different types of animal forms, many different types of fungi, many different types of creatures. But what you're really looking at is the proliferation of energy in an environment. The process of animals consuming, eating and all that is to continue to generate chemical energy, but they're getting it from the sun because plants make these things from the sun. So as a result of that, there appear to be physical changes amongst the human beings that live in different parts of the world, that have evolved in different parts of the world. This is what people made into race. Why? Because life behaves in a certain way, just like nature behaves in a certain way. It turns out that one of the ways in which nature behaves when it comes to the human being is that nature prescribes organized complexity on the human being. Organized complexity is blackness. It's the physics of blackness. And the reason why nature does that is because nature displays organized complexity. And organized complexity comes from the behavior of 3 sixes. It's the behavior that is encoded within the distribution of prime numbers at a conceptual level. So before the existence of anything, even space-time. Now, if everything is a manifestation of humanity, meaning that everything is basically just a human being, you look at the stars, the galaxy, what you're really looking at, if you could see it in sum total, of course, it's impossible to grab the infinite extent of it in one view, but you will see a human that is always becoming. That's what you are. That's why you are here. That's why you exist. And you're constantly becoming, which is basically your way of constantly trying to procreate so that you can go on. That's sex. Because even though you can use asexual reproduction for organisms that are very simple to make in some sense, I'm using the word simple relatively. When it comes to complex life forms, you have to go sexual because you need to generate a sufficient level of complexity to be able to build that type of living creature. And by the time you get to the human being, you need the greatest amount of complexity. You need robustness. You need diversity because that is how the sustainability is maintained. Now, what races promote is that there are actually different types of human beings, meaning that they're not supposed to mix. Well, I'll tell you what will happen. And this is a biochemical fact. It doesn't matter what you think about it. If you identify as purely white and you keep that whiteness, right? Age after age after age, then what will happen is that that whiteness will naturally face the pressures of extinction. It won't go extinct, but it will constantly face those pressures. Why? Because life, human life especially, requires the injection of diversity. And since the prescription for humankind is a prescription of organized complexity, which means it's a prescription of blackness. That's why the first human beings were black. That's why humanity started in Africa. It's not coincidence. There's an exact physics behind it all. A physics sufficiently complex enough and simple enough to be prescriptive. Okay. Now there's a push in the narrative, in the mainstream narrative, to reverse all of that understanding because obviously anti-black racism is a compulsive obsession in foolishness. So it's basically just lie about it, but the physics is very clear. That blackness is an expression of your nervous system. That's the way that the human nervous system is put together. And when it's successfully put together, once it begins to construct layers of beauty that are on a high level in terms of functionality, it begins to produce melanin. You can think of it as some type of black light. It begins to produce melanin because it's telling you something about the functional organization and the efficiency that has just been achieved in that organization. It's functioning at a very high level. We experience this, but we call it pleasure because we experience what has now been identified, the chemical part of it, as dopamine. But what people don't realize is that dopamine is just another form of melanin. That's why all the dopaminergic cells in your brain, they're pigmented with melanin. Racism is an erroneous point of view. It's a very ill-conceived point of view. And it was conceived of by the human creature who suffered the most diminishment because that creature belongs to the most solar-deprived environment. Do you understand? And it cannot accept that. Now, there's nobody pressuring any human being based on what environment you come from or what environment you don't come from. There's nothing really outside the laws of nature. It's not being done by another human being. It's just the way that nature built the world. And nature built the world that way because of organized complexity. Because without that, it cannot be self-sustainable. So it's impossible to change, really, because to change that dynamic is to end all life, basically. So nature enforces organized complexity. It enforces it in everything. The racial ideology, anti-black racial ideology, is to reverse this enforcement so that everything can die. And it's being done as a result of some type of envy, which is basically plutonic reality that doesn't sit well. It doesn't sit properly within the individual. The individual has disowned it. And so they have to disown it as something or someone. And they have disowned it as black Africans, black people. Do you understand? And when you disown that type of thing, you are basically looking at your Pluto. And that's the way it is for all Pluto in the 7th house. They're looking constantly at either something they desire most and at the same time something they fear. That's the nature of the emotional intensity. That's how it sits. It's a posture. And when you see it, when you feel it, you will know what I'm talking about. Because people who carry Pluto in the 7th house, they carry the poise of the Scorpion in some sense. And intensity is like a hook waiting to latch onto something. Now, where they struggle is in the disowning of this, because this is power. But for it to be power, you must know and understand what it means, and you must know how to carry it. Because if you try to grab that Pluto, it doesn't like that, because it doesn't belong to you. It's a natural force. So when you try to grab it, it responds in some sense. And remember, this is an aspect of you that is connected to that part of nature. It responds, and it responds by examining you. And once it examines you and it sees that maybe it's sitting in a way that is not correct within you, it's not comfortable, meaning it's being denied, and then it destroys that reality. It grinds it down to zero so that it can give you the opportunity to make it up again. It just wants you to tell a more accurate story. And in Pluto in the 7th house, you must tell a more accurate story about the nature of your own power, because you have it. And so what becomes important is what you're going to do with it, how you are going to use it. And since the theater is the 7th house, the only way that you can use this power is in the lives of others, the ones that you meet. So every time you meet another individual, you are carrying this power, you are carrying this intensity. You must remember so that you don't abuse it. Now, this takes some getting used to, it takes some learning. And so everyone makes mistakes. Normally, the natal chart will prescribe the pathways that open up as a result of the success or the mistakes of these things. But they always lead to transformations. And so Pluto in the 7th house will definitely lead to a type of transformation wherein which a person is simultaneously stuck on something that they don't want to be on, but they cannot let go. And in that way, they perceive that plutonic experience as oppressive. You see? In some other sense, they may see the Pluto, go for it. And so they may come across as very powerful, very intimidating, very intense. And the 7th house is not the kind of place that accepts that thing. It spooks it. The 7th house is a fairy house in some sense. It's a very light social kind of house where people don't really come with their real selves. They come with a narrative about themselves. So it's a narrative that goes from the 1st house projected into the 7th, but it's not a real narrative. It's a projection. So usually they are projecting what they would like to be as against what they really are. Now, this is the process of getting to know you better. And the reason for that is caution. Because the next house from the 7th house is the 8th house. And in that house, everything gets very serious. Because whatever happens, life can be summoned in that house. But if life can be summoned, then life can also be dispelled. So the 7th house is a house that is unique for being able to negotiate these transactions. And people approach themselves carefully. They start by creating these narratives. And then as time goes on, they begin to whittle down on these narratives. And gradually the truth of those narratives emerge. And that truth is what I refer to as those geometric invariants. Because that's what you meet when you begin to know someone. There is a critical threshold wherein which you will know someone. You have already become intimate with that person. Something has clicked. And what has clicked is that you have found similarity. Because there is something about you which may sit in a way that is not quite clear, which another person can deliver in some type of information. And you perceive it through your senses, the way that it affects you. You feel much greater need to become intimate with that person. And like I've said, in today's reality, we have to clarify that intimacy is not really just about sex, because sex can be very recreational, okay? It can be very playful. The type of sex that is indicated in Scorpio is extremely powerful. Why? Because it's very intimate. It is built on truth, and hence all the caution. Because you have to be cautious because of the type of powerful movements that can happen in that area. Okay? That's really what it is. And so Pluto in the 7th house is fully aware of this. That's what makes everything intense for them. Because they are aware of it and they are afraid of it because they know that they can damage life just like they can heal life. And when you are afraid, then the tendency is that you wield power in response to that fear. And so everything about control, everything about territoriality, everything about who's the biggest, baddest, these are the things that become very important to you. They are the things that you're naturally drawn to. They are the things that you embrace as an act of will. Why? Because you're afraid. And so everything is interpreted within the context of self-defense. But it doesn't make any sense because nobody's attacking you. But that's not the sense of self of the permanently fearful. And so what happens is that the way that the psyche protects itself from this fear is to inflate itself to the point where it becomes the biggest, baddest monster in the room so that it's not afraid anymore because there's nobody around that can make it fearful, right? Wrong. Because what has just happened is that the individual has just become afraid of themselves. They've just transferred the fear. Because the only one now that can really hurt them, based on the fact that they've been able to grab all the power, is themselves. Okay? And that's where the transformation of Pluto begins. That's the nature of catharsis. That's how it works. It's that type of realization. Because plutonic forces, because they're hard to understand, because they're so far away from the center of consciousness, they are just perceived as very powerful cyclical forces that bring things into existence or that can take them out. And so the essential fear behind the plutonic functional light is the fear of death. But it's also the fear of the death of a loved one. But it's not really a loved one per se. And this goes back to my podcast on Scorpio and sex, where I talked about Scorpio being some type of awareness of the other. But that there is no other. It's just an aspect of self. The sexual dual of self. Okay? Because as a unity, you must construct that unity from duality as a physical experience. And the only reason why that works, the only reason why we're self-aware because of that process is because you can go from a duality to unity, but you can also go from unity to duality. Okay, that's how it's sustained. That's how it's maintained. So we as human beings, we come into existence. We are a unity, but we have two sides to our brain. But those two sides, they work in a way that we don't feel the two sides. We feel ourselves as a unity. This is what makes it possible. The essence of that unity, because you can go from a duality to a unity and a unity to a duality, the essence of it is what sex is. That's the functional representation, really. Okay? It's a very interesting thing, don't you think? And so someone with Pluto in the 7th house, they're very aware of this, even though they don't know what it is. But because it deepens the mind, forget about all the other events that take place. But what happens is that the process of catharsis deepens the mind. It creates a mind that is capable of understanding deep subtleties. Because those subtleties, they exist in nature. They represent the most beautiful stories that we can tell about nature that are true. That is, to see that there is a grandiosity in the natural world, in the natural order. There's a way that things talk to themselves. There's a thing that they are saying to themselves. And all those things they are saying to themselves and the way that they are saying it, the beauty of it is what we are. We are a constant representation of that beauty. And just like we can stretch our imagination as much as we want, that beauty has no end. It is the perception of that beauty to no end that we describe as paradise. It's the infinite bliss and ecstasy that I talked about. Do you understand? Because that's what it is. These are the things that we must understand if we must solve the dysfunction in the sexual narrative that creates anti-black racism, that maintains it. Because it's based on the male sexual organ. And if you don't solve that problem, the plutonic force has got you. And plutonic forces are powerful. Listen, you can't be more powerful than them because you met existence here. Their power built this entire thing. So you can't wield it. Once you try, it will destroy you. That's how it works. Because it means that the individual does not understand. And so therefore they're not fit. They're not the right fit for the environment. And then it begins to wind you down. And in human nature, Pluto is represented by your sexual organs. It begins to wind you down in the same area where the dysfunction lies. You think it's a coincidence? It's not a coincidence because, the universe, what you're looking at is the expression of a supreme intelligence. And it wants you to develop the subtlety of your mind deeply. Otherwise, how are you going to understand it? How are you going to interact with it? How are you going to even know that it's there? It has done its best to be simple at every level so that you can latch onto it. But it doesn't stay like the simplicity grows, and it grows in a way that is very unique and very beautiful. It wants you to latch into that. That's what that sexual inclination is. That's what that Pluto really is. It wants you to latch onto these cycles, these ways, these laws of nature, if you want to call them that. Because as you follow them and you track them, it's leading you somewhere. And it's leading you to the recognition of something that is stupendous in some sense. Because it's always been there. You're just noticing it. Okay? And that changes behavior. That changes human behavior. Because it's enlightenment. And enlightenment has a very unique thing about it. It feels very orgasmic. Because in some sense, that's what you're really experiencing. Okay? What has that got to do with Pluto in the 7th house? Well, that's the energy they're carrying. They're the type of people that begin the process of creating this type of experience. But they don't know it yet. And so in the initial stages, they see this Pluto outside of themselves. They're terrified of it, but they're also drawn to it. They see it in different people, in different things. And each time they see it, they have emotionally intense connections to those things. And those connections are powerful enough to make those things or break them. They are like inspectors for the plutonic energy in some sense. And every time they find it, every time they sniff it out, they latch onto it. So they come across as the powerful one or the one with no power at all. Okay? Now, what they must do is they must realize what that thing is and how they carry it, where they carry it. And they must know that they see it in everything outside of themselves, especially in the relationships they have with people. And if those relationships become super intense, dramatic, maybe a struggle of power and everything, it's them. It's not the other because there's no other. It's them, the way that they are reacting or relating to what they have just experienced. And I've said, usually the people they are like this with, it's because they can sense what they are in other people. Now, because they reject it in themselves, they reject it in other people too. And that begins the genesis of the conflict. Do you understand? That's what this is. And while they're dealing with all of that, you can imagine that it represents a very powerful sexual drive. So you can find yourself in relationships where you really don't like the person, but the sex is too damn good. You find yourself in situations where you know that this is not good for me, but I can't break away. Addictions are built on these types of things. Because something is forcing through within the psychology of the person, the recognition of their own power. Because they have this plutonic functional light that is significant. It's in the 7th house, it's an angular house. It's significant for them, and it's significant because they are able to define what looks like external reality as a result of that. And the 7th house is where you really begin the stage to externalize an ambition. The ambition that will show up in the 10th house. The 7th house is where you actually start the dynamics, the transactional dynamics. So it's really a theater where you come into contact with all sorts of people. Okay? For the Pluto in the 7th house, every contact feels like an intimate contact. Every contact, it's either they're very, very sensitive with you so that it's possible that you can hurt them without realizing it, or they want to stay far away from you. They don't want that closeness. Now, I've said that that's because they feel the power of this thing. But when they carry that power properly, they can meet with anyone because they know that anything they're stepping into, any relationship they're really stepping into, they are that Pluto. All right? It's the Pluto that is staring at another person, and people are staring at that Pluto. The functional light that is deeply sexual, that is deeply powerful because people project the need for power when they cannot express themselves sexually. It's the reason why men fight. They want to get the woman. The woman's desire is to be chosen by the man that they fancy or whatever. So you see the way this dynamic works. Well, that 7th house is the theater of it all. Now, the man or woman who's carrying this, that's what they're bringing to every theater. And those people that will come into their lives, that's what they're responding to. And some will respond to it in a positive way, which may lead to very intense relationships, sexually intense. Some people may be rebuffed by it completely. It leads to conflicts. Some people may see the idea of Pluto as it's projecting as power as some type of challenge to their own reality, and they may begin to work behind the scenes to neutralize the Pluto. And so you will see these as power games, moves and statements that are made, and they will always be denied. That's what the denial is meant for, is to say, look, I'm not really doing this, but that's the plan, they're doing it. Do you understand? Now, every single one of us as human beings carrying this functional light of Pluto, we must come to understand the nature of power. And that means that we must be able to stare at our own sexuality without guilt, without shame, without anything really but bliss, but pleasantness. Now, if you say that this is impossible, because some people have really strange sexual behaviors, right? If you say that this is impossible, well, you have to ask yourself why you think that way. If you think it's ugly, if you think it's shameful, well, you need to ask yourself why you think so. And if you're honest to yourself, you will begin to understand why you think so. And if you don't like it, you can change. That's the plutonic transformation. Plutonic transformations, catharsis, they're processes of realization. They just seem very painful is because the thing that is being realized has to do with sex and power. And anytime anything has to do with sex and power, it appears as if it's playing right into the nature of existence itself. Life or death. You see? Now, a being, a self-aware creature that has learned to perceive a tremendous amount of beauty. Now, the type of beauty I'm talking about, I always say something about it. I always say the most beautiful stories that are true. That's the nature of knowledge. If you look into any area, for instance, in theoretical physics, you find a lot of laws, a lot of mathematical descriptions. These descriptions are regularities. Why? Why do you have regularities? It's because they are relationships. Some of them are expressed mathematically because they can also be expressed geometrically. And if you see the geometric forms, there's a beauty behind them all. Because it doesn't have to be that way. Why does it have to be this way? It could have been any other way. And you understand that the reason why it is this way is because everything is that way. Do you realize the power of that? The power of these types of realizations? Because what else are you realizing? You are realizing the nature of existence and you are realizing the nature of yourself. It changes you. And the thing that it changes is your sexual behavior. Because once you get the taste for beauty, you want beauty. Nothing else will do. Beauty and truth give you that every day of the week, every moment of your existence. Because it's a hunger. Why? That's why you are built in ignorance, so that you don't know yourself. So that when you find this hunger, it's all that you will ever want. That's why when power is abused, which is something that I'm talking about because of the 7th house, Pluto in the 7th house, when it is externalized as a response to fear, abuse, then the individual begins to draw in the cyclical aspects of Pluto that take things out of existence in some sense, and recycles them, because it generates stories that are very ugly, stories that cannot be accepted really, because that's not the way that you are built. You are built for enlightenment. That's what your self-consciousness is mapping into. You are mapping into the universe, all its details, all its structures, those you can define, those you cannot define, those you are aware of and those you're not aware of. You're mapping into all of them consistently. That's how you maintain your connection to existence. It's a very plutonic thing because it's being done sexually. That's how you feel it. Okay? So once you begin to abuse those powers and you think that you can wield it, it doesn't work like that. If you look through many of your religious texts, especially what you now call the Old Testament, these are the this is the structure of the narratives. This is the structure that's really sitting underneath it all if you really pay attention to it. All right? Now, for the Pluto in the 7th house person, the best they can hope for is that these realizations, that they happen relatively smoothly. They don't happen in powerful cathartic forms that can be extremely painful because Pluto likes the theater of intimacy. That's where you can feel it. And that's where things can go, when they go wrong, they go horribly wrong with transformative properties. Okay? Now, rest assured that those properties are already part of your life story. You can't really break your life. Let me put it that way. You can't really break it. What you can do is you can generate consequences, which is just another way of reconciling all the stories you have told to the one story. Because there's only ever one story. That's the magnetic pull you feel sexually. There's only ever one story. And everybody really is partaking in that one story. As long as you keep this in the back of your mind, it's all hunky-dory. But when you begin to imagine that there are so many types of stories that can be, then you begin to create all sorts of things that you don't want. So sometimes you may say, am I listening to an astrology delineation or placement delineation, or am I listening to some type of science channel, or am I listening to just some type of philosophical channel? Well, there's no difference really. Like I've said, the basic knowledge of human consciousness is human consciousness. Every other thing is just a definition of human consciousness. So your physics is a definition of human consciousness. Your math is a definition of human consciousness. These are just individual narratives from the one narrative. So when you think that there are many narratives, no, there are many manifestations of the one narrative. When you look at your astrological wheel, that's what you're looking at. The type of behavioral characteristics that would make up the archetype of Aries, for instance, they express themselves in a myriad of ways in your behavior. But behavior within a human is something that is biochemically generated. And if you map the biochemical representations to the archetype that you call Aries, it looks like noise. It looks chaotic if you had to see those processes that help you to deliver the behavioral archetype called Aries, right? And yet, Aries is just one of 12 in a circle. That 12, that Aries, all the details, they just belong to one thing. That's why it's a circle. That's why you have a single brain, okay? So do you know what it takes to look at all the biochemical expressions that you would call Aries, or all the social expressions that you would call Aries, and then map them to a set of constellations? That's why people say astrology doesn't make sense. And the reason why they say that is because they have not achieved the level of connections between the discourses. And this means that these are connections within the person, mapping from one part of their psyche to another. They have not been able to make those connections, okay? Because I can assure you that the connections exist, and you can define them the way that you define any type of physics today. Because those connections, they don't really exist outside. They exist as you. The constant realization of this is what you call Pluto. Every time the realization comes in, reality is transformed. The modern day is characterized by the fact that dysfunctional light Pluto sits in some type of twisted form. And so the kind of reality it delivers, it contains all the miseries that Pluto can deliver. It's very destructive, very cruel, very wicked, very hurtful. All of these things are emanations that are coming from the interpersonal relationships between human beings. That is, we're talking about self-conscious beings that don't know what they are. They don't know where they are. And they have no idea what they are doing here as conscious beings. They don't know what any of it means. Or so it seems, because the story is far more complex than that, and it's also very plutonic, secrets that have secrets. Because what you're looking at is a theater of experience, where some type of awareness has been what? Manufactured. And since it is manufactured, there are control systems that try to maintain the consciousness that has been manufactured. Well, that manufactured consciousness, the Pluto doesn't sit well. That uncomfortable sitting of the Pluto, that's what you call anti-black racism. The exact reasons for racism are a taboo. Once you bring them up, everybody begins to panic. Both the ones the racism is against and the ones who are doing the racism themselves. Everybody begins to panic. Do you know why? Because now you are talking about sex. You're talking about power and the things that people do triggered by their connection to that sexual function. That's what you're now talking about. And there's a reason why people wear clothes. You wear layers of clothes. Why? The most essential thing that you are protecting is your sexual organ. You are concealing it from view. Why? It's because you are aware of it. And you are aware of the knowledge or the importance that is connected to that sexual function. You've been aware of it for a very long time. But now that awareness has the added potential for modifications to the narrative. That's what it means to be a human. That's what it means to be self-aware. Okay? Well, there's a reason why most people also make love within the privacy of their own homes, within the privacy of their bedrooms, or within the privacy of wherever. Like I've said, there are many types of sex. I'm talking about intimate sex. There's a reason why privacy is an essential ingredient. Because the matters that all these things are concerned with are the matters that basic societies, just societies in general, they don't feel comfortable because of the stories those societies are telling about these things. But I can tell you that sexual behavior, that sexual knowledge and understanding, it's far more important to why you are here than anything else that you think that you're doing. Without it, nothing that you're doing will make any sense. I mean, think about if people couldn't procreate today. Within 100 years, it's all over. The meaninglessness of everything will become immediately apparent. Okay? It's the one story. And it's been here as an expression of this universe since forever. It's in everybody. It's Pluto. When you find it in the 7th house, then you know that, well, Your entire life will be dealing with this. Just get used to it, get comfortable with it. Wear it like a robe, a beautiful robe, a garment. The only thing you would know if when you're being cruel, and if you start being cruel, you will know. It's evident of the fact that you are not carrying it properly. You're really letting it get to you. You should carry it like it doesn't exist. Okay? And one of the ways in which Pluto is carried properly is by understanding the nature of goodness. You have to understand what goodness means. What does it mean to be good? Is it being moral, ethical? What does it really mean? You see, from a natural point of view, goodness is functionality. A square peg in a square hole. Now, I use the word square, but organized complexity really is extremely complex than your simple geometric forms. They're complex patterns that talk to each other. They talk to each other because they have ways of interacting with each other because they're coming from the same place. It's either that or you can't have life. You understand? Well, that's what goodness is. The ability of everything to talk to each other, to connect with each other, so that once something starts in one place, it's already affecting everybody. Alright? That's really what it is. There are no places that say, oh, I'm immune to that or I'm isolated from that so it can go to hell, I don't give a shit. It doesn't work like that. That's not the nature of functional goodness. And when we begin to understand this, which is what the Pluto in the 7th house person needs to understand, the nature of goodness allows you to carry this type of functional light in the 7th house without destroying people and destroying yourself. In your everyday world, what would that look like? Well, the unity in your everyday reality is you. The way that you feel emanates from that unity. Once something begins to go outside of that, you will know. You will feel it as a sense of discomfort. Something is not right. And if you are aware that it is that Pluto which you are externalizing, you are seeing it, you are receiving it in some sense, right? Once you are aware of that, you will know precisely what is wrong. It will be easy to narrow down what has shifted your inner balance. That is, if it's not deliberate, because if you are learning, if you're in a learning period, you can decide to be shifting your balance. But the more profound realizations, they really have no self-consciousness behind them. Everything just comes together, boom, and there it is. Okay? Very, very important. That's how you know what goodness is. And you carry it within your life, within your reality. Okay? The enemy of goodness, obviously, is ignorance. And ignorance is carried by denial. And denial simply means that you stop listening to that part of yourself that keeps you in touch. You separate yourself from yourself in some sense. And you disown it. Well, the plutonic function rises as a result of that. That's the process of creating it. It just comes into being. And because it is denied, it begins to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And it shows up in dysfunctional sexual behaviors. It shows up as dysfunctional behaviors in the realm of power. You understand? And it can be extremely destructive. Pluto in the 7th house also represents someone who has this penchant for meeting people who carry a significant amount of financial power. Now, the reason for that is because financial power is one way in which power is expressed, and power comes from sex. And since Pluto in the 7th house acts like some type of antenna in the realm of the reality that you're observing, people with Pluto in the 7th house, they are drawn to these types of people. So, Pluto in the 7th house describes relationships with people that are built around secrecy, that are built around some type of hidden arrangement. Powerful hidden arrangements, especially in the area of finance. It is not unusual for people with Pluto in the 7th house to be controlling large amounts of money. And not money in the terms of what you buy and all that. No, money in the terms of policy. Policy, financial policy that shapes behaviors of a large number of people. Alright? That's one way in which it can manifest. Because remember, the lesson is always the person must be introduced to power. Either they perceive it as their power or they perceive it as the power held by others over them. The idea is that they must find some type of relationship, some type of balance that allows them to wield that power well enough without abusing it. Now, most Pluto in the 7th house delineations you will listen to, it wouldn't sound like this. And it's not a criticism to anything or to anyone or even my channel. I'm basically saying that the people who are drawn to my channel, there's a certain way that they think. There's a certain question that they carry. There is a curiosity inside them that draws them to my work. Well, what have I been talking about the last hour? You are called by something inside you that seeks to connect to something else. And there's a reason. The reason you find it in your own reality. That's how it works. When denial comes in, it blocks this process or pretends that it doesn't exist. So that the real reason why you are drawn, you know it, but you can't accept it. And once you do that, it becomes somebody or something external of you. And once that manifests, you're afraid of it. And then you begin to seek to control it, to wield it, to manage it in some sense. But you're managing a part of yourself, the part of yourself that has been denied. And the thing about denial is that since it's not real, the reality that it denies is still there. It doesn't go anywhere. You have just chosen not to pay attention to it anymore. But these cycles, like I've said, when they begin to become unbalanced, they start becoming very destructive. Okay, so you have things like the climate falling apart, the biosphere of the earth behaving in strange ways, the ocean behaving in strange ways. Everything starts to behave strangely. It means that the theater of experience is reacting to the dysfunction. Now, why would your sexual stories be connected to the climate? Do you realize what we're talking about here? It's because you live in a reality that is a oneness. The connections go as far as they need to go to maintain that oneness consistently. And since you are mapping into that reality and you are experiencing that mapping as a sense of self, well, you experience those connections too. You experience yourself as a brain. Now, where are you in the brain? You're all over and you're nowhere at the same time. So you're all over inside it and around it and whatever. All right. But you experience yourself as every part of that brain. It's just filtered out so that you don't experience the details. You experience the broad features which you construct based on what? Your sense of self that you're building, your ascendant. Okay. And you begin to pattern your stories around that. That's why a lot of people feel like they say, oh, we are all living in some type of simulation, some type of simulated experience. Well, that's not true. You are only experiencing yourself as a reality, a physical reality. You are deciphering all the connections that exist that keep that reality one. So you experience yourself as a constant pressure for oneness. You are constantly resolving that oneness just to be able to be you. Denial, what it does is it comes and it denies this process. It basically says that the oneness doesn't exist while it is experiencing it. Okay? So it sets up a different type of universe, a different type of reality. All right. And because it's denial, it means that there are many parts of that reality that are not perceived because you have denied the connections. Remember, you are those connections because those connections are real. And the essence of all the connections is that at their zenith, they're the most beautiful thing. And so you block that beauty with the denial. It doesn't mean that the connections are not there in nature. They're there, but you block access to that. So that is a process of limitation because the human being now has like a threshold beyond which it cannot go because the connections are missing. That's why people look at astrology today and they no longer understand what they're looking at because there has been a deliberate blockage of some kind. That's really what it is. Okay, so I'm going to round it up here because it's already long, but obviously it's more than just Pluto in the 7th house. There are some things I just wanted to talk about because people are not living in a simulation. They're experiencing a brain. They're experiencing all the features of that brain. All right, the brain has 85 billion neurons in the average adult, right? Well, there are many other types of brain cells, not just neurons, and they're all talking to each other. They're all in some type of, you can't even imagine what that is, a network or whatever, but that's what you're experiencing as yourself. And those connections, they are mapping into the connections that exist as a universe. That process of mapping into something that you're experiencing, that's self-consciousness. That's why you feel like reality is a simulation. You're experiencing yourself as a process that's being generated. So normally the idea is, the first question in your head is, who is the generator? And if you think that this is a coincidence, you've not understood it. It's a deliberate design. All right? Because that question gets you searching. Once you get searching, you get mapping. Denial interferes with this process. And so systems that are constructed in denial, they are managed realities where your access to everything is basically being managed and controlled. Okay? And that's why the reality, the 21st century reality, that's why it looks the way it does, because we can't sit that as human beings. We can't. Do you understand? Because before the control system, we are the one story. So whether you're allowed to make the connection or not, at some level of your being, you are making that connection. So what happens is that every denial system is eventually destroyed. And they're mostly destroyed by the same people who constructed them. Why? Well, simple. Like I said, a taste for beauty, there's nothing else you will long for anymore. And beauty comes from those connections. And when the hunger grows to a sufficient level, then everything that stops that beauty will literally just be eliminated, will just be destroyed. Pluto in the 7th house is the beginning of that process, because the person is a key member of this type of dynamic that examines a reality on a plutonic level and then makes transformations or changes based on those realities, based on the awareness of those realities. And the thing that's being searched for, it's searching for itself, the nature of existence. And that's what you should be mapped into naturally as a human being. If you're not, then there's something wrong.